Hello, guys, welcome back. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the deep, dark places of the Warhammer world. We're going to be looking at Warhammer Quest 1995 and why I think it's one of my favorite games of all time. This guy captured my imagination when I was a kid. I love the idea of delving out into the deep, dark places to play a kind of Warhammer based RPG game. Although, to be honest, calling it an RPG game is kind of generous. Most of the time, there wasn't much roles to play other than that of a kind of inept, slightly sociopathic adventurer in the deep dark places of the Warhammer world, going and questing of like going to quest, to solve tiny little challenges, to fill in, to take out like little rival war bands of people who hired you to just generally be a troublemaker in the world of the Warhammer setting. So despite this, I loved it greatly. Now, many people I think are a lot more familiar with games like Cursed City. Those are more recent iterations of the Warhammer Quest genre. That sort of dungeon crawling adventure that you take part in with a few like-minded friends, usually cooperatively. And these are games that absolutely captured my imagination when I was a kid. Now, to put it in context, I'm a middle child, right? Like, so I had an older brother who was into these games. I have shared a little bit more about how I got into these games in the beginning. And as a middle child, definitely I was the player two in this scenario, right? My brother was Ryu, I would be Ken. Does that make sense? So when I was playing games like these, I got very into the idea of playing cooperatively because my brother, being older than I was, he was definitely better at games. So to find my niche, it was often a lot more fun for us to play cooperatively, and that's something that I find it's beginning to scratch more of a niche, more of an itch for me rather as I get a little bit long in the tooth with my gaming hobby. Anyway, this is a barbarian. What's a barbarian? In the context of Warhammer, we're talking about things like Dark Oath, barbarians recently, but really barbarians back in the day started as Norscan barbarians, which is, I mean, it's in the name, right? It's obviously Norse barbarians. They're clearly Viking inspired, but oddly enough, they always brought in some like little Native American elements as well. Just in terms of the patterning and the markings in early Games Workshop. I think Games Workshop really draws on a lot of places for inspiration. So it's not too surprising that they took a little bit of everything and mishmashed them together into something that looked kind of cool. So this guy, I'm beginning by blocking in his flesh. As usual, the undercoat is my favorite Pylox grey-white, matte grey-white. And I'm going in with my standard flesh mix, which, as you know, from watching earlier videos, I'm sure, is a combination of Guilliman flesh as well as Seraphim Sepia in a 50-50 ratio. Um, all of these, like formulae, I started to attach to all of my videos at the end of my description. So if ever I talk too fast for you to take note of these mixtures, should you choose to emulate them, you can go right ahead and have a look in the video description and all of my recipes that I use there. And I will be continually updating this list. So not to worry, I won't leave you in the dark as to how I mix these things. None of these things are proprietary, right? If you think they might serve you well, then please go ahead. You have my blessing to use it and to share it as the case may be. So yes, Norse barbarians, clearly Viking inspired on some level, yet typically mixing in a little bit of the spirituality of Native Americans, I feel. Insofar as they've got things like tribal markings, they've got like animal inspired. And look, I'm perfectly aware that this is the most derivative kind of cultural appropriation mindset that you can think of. But at the time, to 8-year-old, 10-year-old me, I was just really excited by the idea of these things. By the time I started doing models for myself when I was 11, these were not topics that were being readily discussed. So what we did was we just kind of took it and ran with it. And I guess once you mishmash enough things and you sort of hide your tracks, as it were, it kind of develops a personality of its own. And I guess that's where GW's modern Dark Oath barbarians are. They've gone quite far from the original source material. Warhammer as a setting generally is a lot less Tolkien, a lot more an original creation of their own design, so to speak. And that's how it has to be. So you usually start out as a derivative work, and then over time it kind of becomes more and more your unique creation. Anyway, long rambly introduction short. This is the barbarian, that quintessential kind of Conan the Barbarian inspired character. Very very inspired by that series of movies. But I think one thing that maybe gets de-emphasized a little bit later in further editions of Warhammer is the idea that not all Norskans are actually chaos worshippers, right? There is a whole range of spiritualities and deity and animal worship and pagan rituals and so on. So Norskans as a whole are a pretty diverse bunch. They have a level of comfort with malign entities from the realm of chaos, but frankly that's just a necessity to survive where they do in the Warhammer world, up in the north where everything is kind of at the limit of human endurance, and therefore just that little bit harder to survive. And therefore, because they are so close to that subsistence line, anything that gives you a bit of a leg up in terms of power to help you survive the harshness of the environment is valuable to you. So this model isn't very detailed, right? I'm sure up until this point you've been having a close look at the miniatures I've been painting. I love these old models because they've got a certain level of charm to the way that they're sculpted and designed. But this is one of the first plastic, in fact, this is the first plastic model that I'll be tackling on this series. And as you look closely at it, you can tell that it's not the most detailed figure. They're large expanses of just detailless, featureless like sections on it, and that's because this model is a plastic model, right? When they released Warhammer Quest in 1995, I think what they wanted to do was to have starter adventurers out of the box, and they knew that these would be a selling point, so they had to be unique miniatures. So we had the dwarf, the elf, the barbarian, and the wizard. The elf was more or less a wood elf, as far as I could tell. I will be tackling him on a separate episode, but generally speaking, the elf was a wood elf, a sylvan elf, I suppose it would be, from the Forest of Lorraine, which is a setting within the Warhammer world. The barbarian, as I mentioned before, is a Norscan barbarian. There is a dwarf from the old world as opposed to a dwarf from the world's edge mountains. Dwarves that integrated more with human society generally were a little bit more chill, not so grudgesome, although they did definitely share those traits with their kin, just not quite so grudgesome, not so driven by revenge, I suppose, unless it was personal tragedy, a bit like the Troll Slayers, for example, of which there was a Troll Slayer character, by the way. There was a wizard as well, and the wizard, oddly enough, was styled like a shadow wizard, Law of Shadow, Algu. So he had the whole hat and feathers and generally Gandalf-looking beard, Grey Pilgrim sort of action, and that's mainly because I think at that time Games Workshop was pursuing something that was a little bit closer to the whole Tolkien paradigm, and as a result, you had the Grey College, and the Grey College was very, very Gandalf-looking. Although, when you look at the way the rules were written about magic in the Warhammer world, in Warhammer Quest, you get very rapidly you get the impression that what you were dealing with were really hedge wizards, not battle wizards at the time, not battle mages. You were looking at people who were like peddlers of cheap tricks, as Gandalf would say, and they would go around from place to place, peddling their particular brand of wizardry and trickery. And generally speaking, Warhammer Quest characters were kind of an unsavory lot, as it were. So what I've done is I have blocked in our Guilliman Flesh and Medium mix, right? Contrast medium. What's missing on this label, of course, is the Seraphim Sepia. That's the third component. And I've gone in to re-establish some of the darker areas, the deeper crevices of his muscles, which we'll be emphasizing a little bit more. Yeah. So when I saw this model, I was like, whoa, I had to have it. And recently, when I managed to get one of these again, I was like, okay, I have to paint this for the channel. There's something fairly exciting about the idea of painting large expanses of human flesh. barbarian style, look at the muscularity and all that kind of thing. If you're a fan of bardic broadcasts, such a legend, such an inspiring human being as well, and very brave, brainy, and thinky. You guys should definitely check his channel out, Bardic Broadcasts. The Bard, who is an Australian, discusses fantasy with a fantastic accent and just really, really deep analysis of storytelling and world building. Love it, as well as the tropes of high fantasy and so on. Yeah. Anyway, so Barbarian, blocked in the flesh, deepened the shading, and to me the next step is to move on to something else bordering this while I let it fully dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to jump over to his cloth, which is really it's the lining of his cape, his odd little teddy bear cape at the back. So that's going to be red. So let's jump into that. So I'm using my traditional red mix. This is a combination of Blood Angels Red and Gryphhound Orange, as I've mentioned many times. Again, check the video description for recipes in case these are hard to follow. I will try my best to mention them when I can, but sometimes I imagine I will probably miss mentioning it. And when that happens, yeah, definitely check the video description, as well as other little details that I want to clarify and so on about the models that I'm working on. So, nice deep red. I imagine this is the inner lining of his cloak. And in the game, you commanded one of 4 different warriors, hopefully together with 3 other like-minded friends to form a party of 4. There were many characters that you could choose from, but the box option was Barbarian, Dwarf, Elf, Wizard. And you could pilot this character into the deepest and darkest places of the Warhammer world, where you would encounter horrible danger, absolutely mind-bending horrors. And honestly, if I have to be absolutely brutal about it, the game was way too hard at the starter level. As a starting out level 1, battle level 1 hero, it was prohibitively difficult, right? Like almost comedically so. Because the moment you walk into a dungeon, into a randomly generated dungeon, the kind of enemies that you will walk slap bang into, I mean, just the sheer number of times that my gaming group and I, and we played this game as adults, right? Recently, we took it up again. The sheer number of times we had to reset because like a group of minotaurs came and wiped us out, wiped the floor with us. Or that one time we went into a dungeon and frankly what happened was a portcullis dropped behind us, locking us into the dungeon, preventing us from like backtracking and leaving if we needed to. And then the minotaur showed up. And they absolutely wiped the floor with us, right? Like one by one. And the nature of this game is, the cool thing about this game, the thing I like greatly about it, as well as maybe what you could consider it one of its greatest flaws as well, is the idea that once one of you goes down in a welter of blood, the rest of you are doomed, because the difficulty is pegged at 4 players, right? So if you've got 3 other people limping back to the surface, the chances of you actually reaching safety are just really, really low. So you might wonder, why on earth would I consider that a design strength? I consider it a design strength because when you're a middle child and you're basically the younger brother in the equation, the fact that players who are older than you, who are better versed at manipulating the rules and maybe understanding the rules better and are better players overall, they start to watch out for you because they need your strength. They need you to be a part of the monster bashing process. And when a party is down to 3, it simply cannot muster the killing power required to carve through the legions of enemies that keep respawning and keep trying to come after your life. So as a kid, trust me, I felt really important because I was a key part of the survival strategy, and that felt really good for a young player, right? Somebody who was very new to this world of miniature games. This is light flesh. I'm starting to mix up the highlights for the skin. Yeah. Sorry, I'm on the verge of wanting to cough. So I think what I'll do is I'll just take a drink. Give me a second. Sorry. Much better. Sorry guys, almost was about to cough into the camera, and that's no fun. You don't want to blow out your headset. So yeah, putting a pair of lines here on his bicep, this is an example of a part of the model where there's almost no detail on it at all. No detail about what we make. Oops, a bit big, but that's okay. Sorry. Yeah, so it felt good to be needed, I guess, is what I'm trying to say about this process. And I think that's something that's really kind of missing about new Warhammer Quest games, right? Like, so this is a contentious point, and I've had long debates with my gaming group about this, right? Gentle, sort of friendly debates, but debates nonetheless. The idea that the PvE aspect of the game, clearly all of these games are PvE, right? You're meant to sort of explore and do things together. But I think what old Warhammer Quest did that newer Warhammer Quest does not, in my opinion, is Warhammer Quest in 1995 tried very hard to tell you that the Warhammer Quest, the Warhammer world, was a terrible place. It really created the sense of a place that was extremely dangerous, that was utterly inimical to life, and that you have to be kind of slightly insane to be wanting to explore it. There was no power trip to be had here, right? Like, there's no power fantasy here. Your heroes are so out of their depth when they go into the dark places of the Warhammer world that your odds of survival are just like really, really low. Honestly, if you could survive past your first mission, that's amazing. If you can get enough money to scrape together some armor and equipment to sort of lengthen your life expectancy, then that was huge. And that would often determine whether or not you could continue to keep playing or not, or you had to restart with another warband with new characters and so on and so forth. Newer Warhammer games, they're designed to let you complete them, right? I think the game designers have done a really good job of creating a game that makes you want to finish it, in a way. But in that sense, I don't think it offers the same levels of challenge that old Warhammer Quest did. Old Warhammer Quest had a tendency, because of the way it was designed, to make you band together with your fellow players, to seek advantage, to work together and to cooperate, and to, you never thought twice about throwing your last potion, your last healing potion, at a wounded player to bring him back, because you knew deep down that you needed him to survive. And so it became a communal thing. It was the opposite of a power fantasy. It was survival. Newer Warhammer Quest games, I feel, are a little bit more about beating the enemy in your own special way. And I get that has its own appeal and its own charm. But for young me, who wasn't really even sure how these games were supposed to be played, like I had only a very dim idea of how I was supposed to be using these things to my advantage. It felt good to be part of a party that needed my abilities, and therefore, we worked. The fact that we were working closely together in order to try to survive felt really good, and therefore the world felt really dangerous and really exciting to explore every single time we went into these dungeons. Yeah, so that's just the memories I took away from it. Maybe it's a bit of Stockholm syndrome, to be honest, but it felt really keen and really exciting every single time we played together. And it was really, really nice because, we had power gamers amongst us, right? People who know how to exploit the rules. And these people would be actively looking out for people who were maybe a little bit newer to the game, or who were a little less engaged with the game, because you required a little bit of power gaming in order to survive, except that the power gamers were now using their powers for good rather than for evil. So that was kind of cool. The PvE experience felt so unfair that, frankly, any kind of rules exploit felt justified, and therefore that was really exciting to get through together as a group. It was nice to see the power gamers and the casual players together on the same side, right? Trying to do their best to survive the horrors of the dungeon. And that's very, very satisfying for me. Yeah. So, okay, Barbarian Lad has had the basics of his skin highlight applied. This is just a mix of the light flesh color that I showed you earlier together with the original contrast. And as you can see, I've been applying it to try to create a little bit more of an interesting texture on the surface of his skin. There's not a lot of detail going on here, so what I'm doing is I'm using my own knowledge of anatomy to try to supplement it. But broadly, I find that if you can if you roughly understand where all the muscle groups are, and to be fair, I'm sure we all have a basic working understanding of muscle groups. I think it's easy to understand where we want to emphasize these things. Right now, I'm just putting a bit of color onto the back of his knuckles. That usually helps to define his hand nicely. Oh, and on the subject of hands, my god, he has a huge hand. I'm convinced. So, when Blood Bowl 2020 got released, one thing I noticed was a giant leap forward in the quality of the sculpting of their hands. The Black Orc team, as well as the Imperial Nobility team, both had like wonderful open hand sculpts for both the Black Orcs as well as for the Goblins, as well as for the human players. They had like wonderful open hand sculpts. This was not a thing back in 1995, as you can tell with this guy. This hand, I believe, created tons of grief for the sculptors trying to get it like done in plastic. Where, you know, as you know, you use a steel mold and the tolerances are even less forgiving as opposed to the vulcanized rubber molds that were being used for pewter or lead miniatures. So plastic imposed a lot more restrictions on the process, and as a result, this guy's hand is a horror show. Right? It's this giant, like he's got elephantiasis of the hand. But that's what they had to work with, right? And rough though it is, I believe this paved the way for the amazing design that you now see in later games. In particular, like I mentioned, Blood Bowl 2020, where the quality of hand sculpts got absolutely amazing. Like the Black Orcs have the most beautifully gnarled punches, which is not a sentence that I thought I would use ever in my life, but I kind of feel it's pretty amazing. If you ever get a chance to check it out, I recommend you do. And play Blood Bowl in general, because it's a great game. Wonderfully frustrating, but you know, it's kind of cool. While we're on the subject of board games, I like Games Workshop board games. I realize in hindsight, I like them more than I like tabletop war games. And trust me, I played a lot of Warhammer tabletop war games. I started in Warhammer 4th edition, and I went all the way until, I think, close to around 6th or 7th. I think I played until 7th, yes, 7th edition. Warhammer tabletop games are great, but because you're measuring, you know, with a tape measure, you're basically playing on an unmarked surface without board squares and so on. There's just so much arguing, right? And I'm playing the game. I'm here to lead, right? I'm not here to read. No, I'm not here to argue with my opponent. I think that's slightly unfortunate. And one of the things that Blood Bowl does, as well as Warhammer Quest, because the game took place on a tiled surface, you didn't have to argue with people. You just kind of got along with the game. You know, you didn't really need to worry about it, because you know, at the end of the day, it's just counting squares, and that to me made a big difference to the kind of like energy that we brought to the table. Now I'm switching up my brush because I'm done with the largest areas of contrast paint. And the next bit I'm going to do, this is just another Ashley size 1, but a bit smaller. Well, not smaller, just fresher, I suppose. I think the next step that I'm going to do is to block in a lot of the fur. And I have a rule, like I mentioned many times before in previous videos. I'm not sure whether you've been checking them out, but if you have, you might remember me saying that I try to avoid, generally speaking, neutral browns, because I feel neutral browns tend to recede and they don't add a lot to the color scheme. Generally speaking, if I have to choose a contrast paint brown to cover a large area of a miniature, it's never going to be snakebite leather. unless I'm doing something very specific. But yeah, snakebite leather is not my go-to choice because it's more of a neutral brown. I try to always steer the color choice more towards either a yellow brown, that's kind of like Nazdreg yellow. And of course, the downside to talking while painting is that I just killed this hair over there, but I'll fix that in a bit. Yeah, so either Nazdreg yellow, which is more of a yellow-brown tone. I feel that's a more visually interesting color, or more towards the reddish-brown spectrum. And reddish-brown spectrum really means Gore-Grunter fur. And I've been speaking to people who've been watching my videos, and they've been telling me, feedback about the way I paint and so on. When people use Gore-Grunter fur, I think often they've got a tendency to not really saturate the surface. To get the full range of colors out of like contrast Gore-Grunter fur, I think you have to not dilute it. You have to kind of just go at it full strength and apply it heavy. Not heavy to the point where it's creating giant pools, but a bit like what I'm doing right now with this Gore-Grunter fur area. I'm trying to just keep it directed to where it's needed. Pools are forming, but I'm kind of draining them and moving them to where the miniature needs a little bit more definition. No half measures with this brown, because otherwise the reddish brown parts, the tones don't come out, and then you're kind of ending up with a neutral gray. So yeah, no half measures with Gore-Grunter fur. I'm afraid you have to go pretty full on. And yeah, no snakebite leather for me except for small areas, unless it works specifically with a particular color scheme, or I'm trying to actually make the model look neutral. So like I've been working on a range of 4th edition wood elves. The edition where the tree men kind of look like carrot monsters. And I've been loving it, working with just muted tones and neutral browns and so on. But that's a very specific thing, right? As with all things, your mileage will vary based on what you're trying to achieve with your miniatures. But I think, generally speaking, if you don't want to think too hard about it, avoiding the use of neutral browns is a really good way to sort of boost the vibrancy of your miniature as a whole, and to make the sort of brown areas of a miniature look more purposeful and visually interesting without too much effort, right? So anyway, I'm basically applying this to his cloak, his furs, which in the game actually had an in-game effect, right? It gave him +1 toughness, which, as you know, toughness is an amazing statistic in Warhammer Quest. The way it works is when you deal damage, you roll a d6 plus your strength, and then you subtract the toughness and armor, which basically most armor gave you points of toughness. So you rolled a d6, you added your strength, and you subtracted armor plus toughness, and that was the amount of wounds that you would inflict on your target. The barbarian started as toughness 4 because he had furs given to him by his I would imagine his mom or his family would kill a bear and give it to him, make a cloak for him to wear into battle, and that would give him a toughness of 4, which was quite unique because nobody else had it other than the dwarf, right? So additions to your toughness would kick into play. It would have an effect every single time your warrior is struck by an enemy. And trust me, this is Warhammer Quest 1995. You got struck in combat a lot, because enemies would appear right on top of you, and they would start swinging as soon as you've had your turn. So being able to tank a couple of hits was really important. So this fur is your lifeline, man. In fact, I will go so far as to say that if you're playing Warhammer Quest 1995 today, the first thing you will do when selecting your party members is to immediately see how much passive armor they can wear, how much armor that they're actually allowed to wear, how many points of bonus toughness you can add to your own character's toughness. So for example, like an Imperial Noble looked like a really good prospect on paper, but because the guy wore expensive silks and he was just unwilling to wear armor of any kind, his survivability was pretty limited. So that's a bit unfortunate. Okay, I'm going to move on into the silver now. My favorite silver, as I'm sure you're tired of listening to now, is Vallejo's Model Air Silver. great stuff. Goes on like a dream, as I've said many times before, and then after that shades down nicely as well. So I'm going to apply this over all the metal parts of the figure. Whether I intend for them eventually to be gold, because this boy has been looting, there's going to be a bit of gold and silver. It's all going to be in this color, as well as areas which I think are going to be largely metal, but which may have, I don't know, non-metallic elements like gems and so on over it. We're going to apply this over the surface, and that's going to let me have a little bit of time to think about what I want to do with those surfaces while it dries. So I mentioned that this miniature isn't the best, right? There are many flaws with this miniature, and one thing that kind of kills me a little bit is just how this pommel attaches more or less to the underside of his hand. This is a gigantic... Ooh, my brush is fraying. Ooh, okay, time to switch to another brush after I'm done with the silver. But yeah, guys, if you're painting and you sort of see your brush like fray a little bit, or start to fishtail a little bit, okay, I know it's not now, but just now it was. That's when you know it's time to switch your brush for a new one. I don't use expensive brushes. I don't believe in them, because I find that any brush, when you do things like use contrast paint, or if you use metallics and so on, I find that they eventually fray really badly. So I would rather a three Sing dollar brush fray than a 25 Sing dollar brush fray. So with that in mind, I have a tendency to just change my brushes regularly, and I use relatively cheap brushes. A bonus is these are actually synthetic brushes, so they don't actually use animal hair. I don't love the idea of using animal hair. I'm not entirely against like the animal industry or anything like that, but I do feel like yeah, maybe if the synthetic materials are there, maybe your products don't need to involve the live animals in any way. If that's an option, then I'm gonna go for it, because, well, why not, right? Rather animals not die, thank you very much. So yeah, anyway, so I am going to keep going, blocking in all the metal or silver bits on this model, and that's going to prepare us for a wash a little bit later on. Let's see, are there any other places that I missed? Oh, he's got a chain. Oh, and I missed that little part. Can you see the little bit above the chain should be flesh colored as well? I'll fix that shortly. It's one of the nice things about having a wet palette, is that all your paints are there, and the open time is increased, so you can jump right in and grab some of that as and when you need it. But yeah, I'm going to be dropping in as much of this silver as I can, and leave that to dry while I consider my next step, which I think might be the next brown that I want to use on this model. So he's obviously a wilderness type warrior, a survivalist kind of warrior. He's not the most sophisticated kind of soldier, kind of fighter, but I think he's got some survival traits, and that's reflected in his outfit, right? He's wearing very natural materials, so it's all going to be a combination of some kind of leather with maybe small amounts of metal that he's found on his travels. So let's jump right into that darker brown. So you either go Nazdreg yellow, in my opinion. You go Gore-Grunter fur if you want a reddish hue, Nazdreg yellow for a yellowish hue, Gore-Grunter fur for a reddish hue, or if you just want a deep brown that you want to forget about, I think Rattling Grime is the way to go. Rattling Grime is that really deep dark brown that you can sort of like put on in the recesses for areas of the miniature that you kind of want to de-emphasize a little bit, or maybe not draw too much attention to, but you still want to have looking fairly nifty and dynamic and neat. I would just go right ahead and drop some Rattling Grime on it. Garrogak Sewers is pretty good as well, although I can't really tell the difference between Garrogak Sewers and Cygor Brown, to be perfectly honest. My preference has always been for Rattling Grime, because Rattling Grime is just a little bit more desaturated, a little bit more grey, and not vibrant, which is what you want. for colors that for areas that you kind of want to de-emphasize or to have recede into the backgrounds, and to not be a major part of your color scheme. So I do like this color a lot. When I first saw it, I was like, okay, this is a perfect substitute for black, which on its own, black tends to be a little bit powerful. It tends to be a little bit too strong, a little bit too desaturated, as it were, with no real color in it. And therefore, on a model like this here, where it's kind of rustic and naturalistic, and everything that he has, probably because it was made from an animal, or kind of dirty and stained and worn with mud and so on, everything would almost certainly have a tiny amount of gray, not gray, a tiny amount of brown in it. It makes sense to not use black on this guy. So the flip side to that would be, say, if you were painting a dark elf miniature, right? A dark elf miniature is a perfect example of when black is 100% appropriate, because those guys would be wearing silk or kind of more processed fabrics, and they would have dyed it a certain color. On a model like this, where it's very likely that a lot of the fabric or the materials that he's wearing are simply undyed or uncured or similar materials, it makes sense to stick to a more naturalistic palette. That makes sense to me from a world building standpoint, which, when you think about it, when you paint a miniature, that's what you're really trying to do, right? Because you're trying to in a way depict the environment that this character lives in a little bit, by way of your color choices, by way of the materials and the painting techniques that you're using. So you just see me use a little bit of the Rattling Grime, because we're keeping them all within that same family of browns. I just use that to shade the little line in between his flesh and his skin cloak, his red kind of lined fur cloak there a little bit. Yeah, sometimes I do these things unconsciously. I'll try to call them out as I do them, but honestly, sometimes I miss it. And if you catch something that I don't explain sufficiently, maybe what you can do is you can let me know. Shout out in the comments. Just raise if I'm explaining too much, explaining too little, or if I missed anything. That usually helps me to create better videos. This series of videos so far has been a dream. It's been absolutely fascinating, because in Singapore, I've taught a lot of people how to paint, and I've answered a lot of people's questions about painting in general, just in person, or over text, that kind of thing, or even during COVID, we were doing a painting thing. My gaming group and I were doing a painting thing where we would paint over Zoom. And what this series of videos has taught me is, I thought I was getting the point across clearly. I was not, because in hindsight, a lot of what I was explaining wasn't very clear, or else needed badly visuals to accompany what I was explaining. So doing these videos has been absolutely amazing for helping me understand my limits as a painting teacher. I do lessons like face to face, and I'm hoping to do more of these soon. I greatly enjoy interacting with people, and this process, it's taught me that maybe I wasn't being quite as clear, or at least it was telling me my limits, the limits of words to express painting concepts in a way that could be understood by people who were new to painting in general. And that's been absolutely fascinating for me. For example, someone mentioned that I actually put a massive amount of water. Well, you know who you are, but I'm not gonna mention your name. But a viewer actually mentioned that I use a massive amount of water in my painting tray, in my wet palette. I do, and the reason for that is quite simple, because I want my open time to be as long as I can. In Singapore, the weather here is fairly humid, right? So things do stay liquid for a long time. I imagine painting in the UK or in the US would be a lot different. But here in Singapore, things do stay humid for a long time. Despite this, I like the idea of of being able to leave paints uncovered and then come back to them a little bit later on. So I have a tendency to use a lot of liquid in my wet palettes, and that's just really good for me when I paint as regularly as I do. And hopefully you guys will join me too for that. I keep finding little parts of the skin I missed, but it's okay. We'll fix these as we go along. My mantra always is, the model is done when you say it is. No need to feel like you're painting to anybody's schedule when you're just out to learn and improve and do a little bit of painting every single day. Another bunch of questions that I've been getting from concerned friends, and I love them all, right? They've been looking out for me, and they've been asking why I'm suddenly making videos, for example. I think I would like to get Singaporeans, well, I mean people near me and people in general on the internet, to the point where we do a little bit of hobby every single day when we can. I know real life is what it is, and you won't always be able to join me every single day, but I like the idea that we all put aside a little bit of time to work on our favorite hobbies and to just chill together. And if life is really busy at this point and you've got something to study for, or you've got a deck to put together, or you've got just lots of things to do, fair enough. Or you've got a young child at home that needs caring for, absolutely not an issue. Put up music videos. I even if you fall asleep watching these videos, I'll be happy, because I think maybe what these videos can be, hopefully, for those of you at home watching this, is that it becomes our daily ritual, right? And we'll do a little bit of this every day, so long as you can stand the sound of my voice and my strange Singaporean accent. Maybe it becomes a little kind of ritual that we do together, and hopefully that adds value to your hobby experience. As we try to break, we try to break the myth that we can't, that we have to paint together, that we have to paint alone, because this hobby is it can be lonely as it is. And that's why I like to get people to think of the idea that, oh, you don't have to paint alone anymore. You can always just come on and put my videos on, and maybe in future we will organize live painting sessions together. You don't have to experience this hobby as the lonely thing that it often tends to be. You can make friends. You can have just people, maybe not in real life because of your schedule, but you can at least meet me online if you want to, and that's perfect. That's exactly what I want to see. All right, so the color that I've broken out just now, like maybe just moments ago, if you can see, is Nazdreg yellow. So that's this little puddle over here, and I've taken out, this puddle here, and I've taken a bit of contrast medium, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this to create a mix that's suitable for blonde hair. This is going to be a Nordic warrior, because I think we're going to stick with the Scandinavian sort of Viking backstory that early Warhammer Quest had for their barbarians. And I'm going to apply this to his hair. And as you can see, right, if you dilute Nazdreg yellow with a lot of contrast medium, you get a color that's very sort of, well, it's yellow, right? It's kind of like it kind of looks like Skeleton Horde, but it's got a lot more yellow in it, and it's quite an appealing bright yellow. A little bit more on the natural side because it's got a bit more brown in it, not quite the garish yellow that you get with Eanden. Well, to be fair, Eanden gives you an orange yellow, and then like Imperial Fist it gives you this like really artificial, very, and I say artificial in a nice way, right? Because artificial yellow has its meaning, has its values as well. It's useful, definitely. But yeah, like Imperial Fist gives you a really bright, artificial looking yellow, which is really, really useful. So Nazdreg yellow, on the other hand, when cut with contrast medium, gives you a beautiful blonde hair color. And I think he's looking pretty good. There we go. So the next thing we're going to do is he's got these cuffs. and this loincloth area. So the original model had a little bit of blue to it. And for this, we are going to use Ultramarines blue, because Ultramarines blue has a little bit more of a desaturated color. It's a bit more, I like to think of it as a jeans or a denim kind of blue, as opposed to say like Thalasar blue, which is a lot brighter, more saturated and intense. Ultramarines blue actually has a really interesting jeans denim color, and I think that's really appropriate for this miniature. That everything that he has, even things which would be made of dyed materials, like richer fabrics that he might have acquired, all of these things have been tanned by the sun and worn out to the point where they're kind of just a bit more desaturated than they were before. So I'm applying this on his loincloth. As you can see, quite a nice jeans blue color. So this is a color that I find can be extremely useful for if you're trying to convey that kind of like 90s like blue jeans kind of look. I've seen people use these on Orlocks, and that kind of fits in with the original Jean-Claude Van Damme biker kind of theme that they had. That's an actual quote from a White Dwarf magazine where the creator of Necromunda talked about how they were inspired by Jean-Claude Van Damme style biker gangs. Not sure which movie there was a Jean-Claude Van Damme biker gang. Honestly. But yeah, that was the inspiration. Somebody who could kick ass in close combat and who wore a lot of denim apparently. So there. Yeah, so these cuffs I will go ahead and do in the same denim color as well, because one of the tricks of designing an effective color scheme is that you don't ever use a color only in one place. With few exceptions, you try to use it in multiple places on the same miniature. So creating what we call a visual triangle, a trio of points with more or less the same color, is key to leading your eye around the miniature. So the logic of it is, oops, I've got a little bit of blue on his leg. Let's fix that immediately. So a bit of clean water and a wet brush will take that off nicely. Yeah. So there's some weird doohickey on his skull. It could be just a little like thing from the casting process. Sorry, this sometimes happens. I'm gonna go in with a pair of clippers and clip this little extra piece off. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. That was weird. Let me just fix that for a second while I go back to my point about denim. Yeah. Okay. So for people who want to organize their color schemes a little bit more, it's always a good idea to use things in trios. So these three triangles, this triangle between these 3 points, really helps to lead your eye around the miniature and to connect things with similar materials, similar colors, and therefore similar logic on the same miniature. Leading your eye around the miniature is a very big part of planning a color scheme. And it can make a very big difference to the way a final model turns out. Okay, cool. I think he's looking pretty good actually. Let's go right ahead and fix up this little bit on his claws. This is using the Vallejo Silver Grey, which is my go-to color for touching up my undercoat of Pylox matte grey-white. So yeah, just making sure that that's nice and bright when I put on the skeleton horde wash over it. And then maybe just cleaning up a little bit of the redmond grime around the edges for his shoes. When you apply contrast paint, it's a good idea to come in and to sort of, after you've applied your initial coat, you can come in again with your brush to sort of clean up and emphasize and refine the shadows, as opposed to basically just letting gravity take the wheel, as it were. And you can apply this exactly to where it's needed, as opposed to just letting gravity do it. I think that's it. There is a point in every painter's life when or career, so to speak, as a painter, where you find that washes, you need to outgrow them a little bit, because washers, good as they are at giving a general kind of shading coat to all, recessed areas on the model, they have a tendency to dull down parts of the model, as well as they have a tendency to go wherever you want them, wherever they want to go. You're really not in control of that process. So this is okay for the initial stages of painting, when you're just trying to put on big areas of color, and hence you can sort of see me doing this with contrast paint. But at some point in the process, you want to come in with a little bit more control and sort of just deepen and darken some areas to give them just a little bit more punch and oomph. I've got a friend who refers to my painting as contrasty, and I think that's kind of the idea. I'm glad that that's the term that she's using, because that's the idea, right? Color where, or depth where it needs to be, is what makes a decent looking model look great, in my opinion. So I am picking up a little bit more of this Gore-Grunter fur to clean up this area here, because I realized that the nails are kind of like that, and the shape of that needs to be respected, the geometry of it, as it were. I've also learned that I overuse the word personality a lot, guys. I'm aware. Personality is just a word that I've been using to replace the word interesting, because I keep saying interesting in real life. And so saying that things have a bit of a personality to them, it's just a habit I picked up. I'm aware of it. Let's try to use more interesting words. In a previous life, I had a job as a copywriter. My degree is in English language and literature, so I should be better than this. Let's work on that together, guys. Okay, cool. So, what goes next? I am tempted to do up his metals a little bit more. So I'm going to just go back in with a little bit more metal to define, a little bit more silver to define the metal areas just a little bit more, as I prepare for a layer of gold wash over these areas. Because I'm a little bit apprehensive about coverage, especially since I found that weird little nubbin on his head. That was weird. Yeah. So a bit more gold to make sure, right up to the edge, to make sure that I didn't get any other colors on it. And I think we'll be okay to do a wash soon. Yeah. In the meantime, while we work our way there, let's define that funny little daggy bit at the bottom of his loincloth. So I'm going to go in with a bit more of the same red that I used for his cloak interior, and I'm going to put on a bit of a daggy pattern, which, to be fair, is on the surface of the miniature. It's just not very deeply defined. And slowly work this in to create that triangular sawtooth pattern. Just very slowly, and then go in with another contrasting color to finish that off. Not very defined, I'm afraid, but such is the life of such is the way of early Games Workshop plastics. Despite this, I love this model to pieces. It was always a model that I always wanted to have. Partly because there was very little in the way of Norscan miniatures, to be honest. At the time, there were lots of Chaos Marauders, and there were lots of Chaos Warriors and so on and so forth. But there was actually very little indication that they were normal people living, or at least uncorrupted people living in the northern areas of the Warhammer world at the time. And so this Norscan miniature was a real breath of fresh air, because it was at a time when Warhammer was getting quite, like, the different nations were beginning to get extremely codified, right? So to put it in context, right, the idea that the Warhammer world is a series of nations with a monoculture, right, or close to it, is a fairly inaccurate thing. So seeing the Warhammer world as a collection of army books, right, or I guess for the 40k like versed amongst you, like a codex or a faction, like for Total War, that is slightly inaccurate because Warhammer predates a lot of this, and uh, Warhammer factions are not always a monoculture. At this time, for Warhammer Quest, I think it was the only game that was talking about the idea that there was an elven quarter in most human cities. Right? There were dwarf quarters with dwarf engineers and guilds scattered amongst the bigger cities in the empire. Yeah, sure. Maybe if you go into a tiny city like Helmgart, like from Shadows of the Hornrat fame, you're not going to find many dwarves because dwarves are a fairly rare sight. I mean, the stories of Joseph Buckman creating a little tavern in the middle of human occupied parts of the world. It's a story because it's unusual, right? It wasn't very common to find dwarves in and amongst human populations. But Warhammer Quest explored a lot of this. Not every dwarf is a Thorgrim grudge bearer, super grudgesome. I like axes and I'm resistant to change and I love tradition and that's all I want kind of dwarf. Like there were many dwarves who made a living in many parts of the old world, and they were quite culturally diverse in that sense, which was really nice because you rarely got to see this in anything other than in Warhammer Quest. Warhammer Quest told you that there was an elf, that there are a scattering of elf nobles, and oddly enough, these actually do work quite well with the background of later Warhammer, right? So it's not as if this is something that they later on dropped. Sorry guys, I'm going to go into Gold Wash. This is my mix of Nazdreg Yellow plus Seraphim Sepia. Details are in the video description if you want to have the recipe for this Gold Wash. But as you can see, it makes a beautiful gold color when applied directly over the silver. As I hope you can see, it's a one coat solution that we can then go on and refine. Yeah, so the idea that the Warhammer world was just a collection of very stereotypical factions, where there is a monoculture, is just not accurate. Definitely, fans of Warhammer roleplay will know that there's a lot more to the various cultures. People who played Mordheim, for example, would know that every single city in the old world, major city, has its own culture. So whether it's the martial pride of the Rieglanders, from their capital of Altdorf, or if you're talking about, the rich boys of Marienburg, who fancy themselves as being, not a part of Karl Franz's empire so much as a bunch of, like a politically important entity because of how much money they make through trade. Yeah, every little culture has its own subcultures and sub-factions, which made them a lot more interesting. Likewise, not everybody believes that Karl Franz is the way towards a unified empire, right? So Warhammer Quest really allowed us to explore that because it talked about things like elven quarters, like dispossessed high elf nobles from Iotane, which is today, I think, one of the high elf provinces. Basically, where Finuba, the seafarer, hailed from. Iotane is the least stereotypical elf faction, insofar as they were located to the south. They operated the ports. They were extremely rich as a result, and their cities are defended by sea guard. The chief city the chief city of Lothern was of Iotane was Lothern. Yeah, hence Lothern Sea Guard, right? Yeah, but you did get a lot of like dispossessed nobles of Iotane, like traveling the world over. Alternatively, you would also meet dispossessed nobles from Tirnok. Tirnok being that sundered realm of the High Elves where the chariots came from, and those would be scattered the world over. When you play, for example, as the Elven Ranger character, you would find that he was making his way and negotiating some of the political alliances of the various the various high elf nobles who were located in different parts of the empire because they probably got kicked out. And I think that was a really kind of fun element and layer of detail that you don't often see in the mainline Warhammer games, except for maybe Warhammer Quest. So I'm going in with a bit of Nuln Oil. Nuln Oil has changed, as we all know, much to our chagrin. This is an earlier bottle of Nuln Oil, but to be fair, you could just as easily take modern Nuln Oil and turn it into something that was closer to the old school Nuln Oil, like I'm using right now, by adding just a drop of Black Legion to the bottle and just powering up that shading effect. This is something that shouldn't be an issue to anyone who's used to the shifting goalposts that Citadel Color sometimes inflicts on you. If you've been collecting your armies for any number of time, you should have picked up a certain amount of color matching skill. If not, now's the time to start because they keep doing it. And maybe working out little bits of equivalency like this within the paint range. Maybe I can sort of help you along by showing you how I mix some of these colors to get a useful effect. So that's it for the metals. I think there's not a lot of metal on this guy. I've done the silver, I've done the gold, and now I will probably leave this to dry a little bit and then come back in later to add a little bit more shading. Yeah, and then just a little bit of skeleton horde. And I'm going to apply this over the claws very quickly, over his laces that I've kept off-white, and over the face of his bear, and over the heels, over the soles of his shoes. Like this, before we work towards finishing off the miniature. Hey guys, sorry, I had to step away from the camera for a while because I had to answer the phone. But we're back. I promise I did no painting in the interim. I promise. You're still seeing everything. I'm not hiding anything from you. Nothing has improved. So yeah. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm taking a little bit more Gorgrunter fur and adding more shadows, intensifying the recesses, and basically trying to have more colors playing on the surface. When I say more colors, because I often shade down or build up layers of shade in opposition to applying highlights, which I feel are a little bit harder to control and a little bit more tedious. What I'm doing is I'm actually applying layers of shade with the original contrast color, building it up a little bit and putting it a little bit more like in between colors to make it visually more interesting. So that's a very long-winded way of saying why I paint this way. Yeah, so I'm going in to deepen the shadows. As you can see, with successive layers of contrast paint, you can actually get the model almost black, almost reading as black, as you can see on parts of this cloak. While on the flip side, the thinnest, most translucent layers of contrast paint, those areas remain really just only lightly tinted, which is why the undercoat color matters a lot for your overall like final look that you want to achieve. So yeah, applying this in layers means that you can avoid the highlighting stage, which I believe is a major problem for a lot of people who paint miniatures. If you're just doing this for a tabletop standard, as I am, at the end of the day, we'll get a miniature that looks good, I hope, but isn't necessarily painted to the highest quality level. That's kind of where I'm hoping for these videos to be good enough for the tabletop, but then we can come in and we can enhance these later. And that's always been part of the plan. Maybe I will do something with that to try to enhance, the finish of these miniatures. And building up subsequent layers of shade really lets you redefine some areas that need a little bit more definition. So like, for example, the part where his arm meets the red of his cloak. Yeah, a little bit of this gold grunter fur goes a long way towards establishing that hard edge and making it look a lot more finished as well. So contrast paint, a great start, not the be all and end all, especially when you realize that you can apply it in layers to achieve a more contrasty looking effect. And that can make a big difference to the way the miniature reads on the tabletop. Doesn't make it perfect. You can definitely take it further beyond this point, but it takes us to a good place where we are feeling like we've achieved something, that there is progress, and the miniature is starting to look decent. And decent is all we ask for, right? Sometimes, after a long day's work, after all the trials and tribulations of real life, we don't necessarily need our hobbies to be a source of stress for us. Sometimes easy wins are wins too. And this style of painting, I feel, has done wonders towards my output, I suppose. I'm painting more than ever before. I'm painting to a standard that I am reasonably happy with to show off on the tabletop, and that's really helped me deal with my backlog of miniatures. And it's also helped me bring up a lot of these bucket list miniatures that I put aside and never really wanted to touch, because I figured that I would need to spend hours and hours and hours on each one. So they were beginning to build up in the dark corners of my home, which is not ideal. So yeah, lots of benefits to painting in this way. I hope I've convinced you. Plus, it's just straight up pleasurable, right? The thing about my painting style is this is very much evolved from when I used to paint watercolor with my father. My father was quite talented at watercolor painting, actually. He was actually really good at working with translucent colors in layers, and therefore when contrast paint became a thing, that really felt good to me on a level that I didn't expect it to. By that point, I'd been painting for a really long time, right? Those of you who might know me from a long time ago would know that I actually have multiple golden demons from Australian Golden Demon. Back in the day when I was in uni, I participated and I won multiple trophies. But at some point, the competitive painting game became a bit stressful, and suddenly, like, painting a cloak would take me hours and hours and hours as I agonize over the smallest details. Right? I wasn't just painting. I mean, to quote Brent, right, from Painting Bravely, the podcast. Yeah, painting bravely is the idea, right? The idea is to sit down and actually get stuff done, as opposed to just think about painting all the time. So that's definitely its own thing. Like, competition painting is its own thing. But to be honest, been there, done that. I just want to paint things which like give me joy, I suppose, is the best way to put it. And this relatively low stakes style of painting, simple though it is, maybe not perfect. I'm not even painting eyes on a lot of models at this stage. I might come back in and detail these properly later, but I'm at least shading the eye sockets now, as I am with a bit of Gore-Grunter fur. I'll come back to these and I'll improve these later. But for now, getting them to a reasonable standard within one sitting is deeply satisfying to me. And I hope it is for you too. And I hope it inspires you to do something maybe not exactly the same, but similar. Okay, cool. Or at least to bring out your models to paint. Yeah, instead of letting them languish in whatever storage spaces that you might have. So we're going to do a little bit of that awesome triggering part again, where I put Agaror's dunes directly from the bottle onto the base and spread it around over this base coat of Pylox matte grey-white spray. This is sand, of course, textured on the surface. I don't really use things like texturing pastes and texture paint and so on. I just prefer the look of this because it seems more consistent. And this base will be by no means finished at this stage. It will look. This is just to get some of the initial basing painted, and this is the best part of every painting video, right? Like that part where you do the base up and it starts to look a lot more finished than it actually is, and that gives us hopefully that sense of completion, that little bit of satisfaction that we've managed to achieve something within one sitting. And this guy's actually starting to look pretty good. Guys, if we all sit down and paint a little bit every day, I think we'll be a lot happier for it, and it doesn't need to be high impact, high octane painting, super exciting using the latest technologies and techniques and so on. It can be just you with a brush for an hour or an hour and a half, as the case may be. Some of these videos are a little bit longer, but yeah, that's maybe all it needs to be. And I hope you find it as satisfying as it has been for me, as we come close to wrapping up this episode by doing the best bit, painting the rim a solid brown color. Such is the excitement level in my voice and in my life these days. This is what I look forward to on a daily basis. Meeting all of you, doing these, and hoping that you'll stay around to watch more of these as we work through my backlog of ancient miniatures. If you've got any miniatures, any bucket list models that you really want me to tackle, I can try to acquire them and get them ready to paint. If not, just let me know roughly what species you want me to tackle, what type of model. Would you like to see more chaos models, more orcs and goblins maybe? What faction you want me to spend a little bit more time on? And maybe I can find miniatures from that range to cover. But for today, questing on, baby. Look at the muscularity. Last time I'll say that, I promise. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed watching me paint this barbarian, and I hope it inspires you to do something similar. If not, if you didn't like this model for any reason, or the bad jokes, you can join me again tomorrow for where we paint something completely different. Alright guys, cheers, have a good day, love you all, bye bye.